Family dinner. Candles, forced smiles, the usual bullshit. Clara pulls a yellowed envelope from her bag and starts reading, voice sharp as glass. My dearest Sarah, I never stopped loving you. One day I'll come back, and we'll leave this all behind. Forever yours, Daniel. The name lands on the table like a blade. Sarah's wineglass freezes an inch from her lips. Her fingers clamp the stem until the glass groans. Because Daniel was Clara's fiancé. The one who vanished the night before the wedding. The one Sarah swore she never knew. Clara finally looks up, eyes wet but steady. He wrote this to you, didn't he, Mom? The week he was supposed to marry me. The glass bursts in Sarah's hand. Red wine, red blood. Same color. One letter. 23 years too late. And the mother just became the other woman at her own table. I thought love was supposed to feel safe, Elena whispered, her voice threading through the thick haze of cigarette smoke that curled lazily from the low table, heavy with the scent of ash and regret. The room pressed in closer, its walls paneled in faded walnut that drank in the feeble flicker of a single brass lamp, stretching elongated shadows across the threadbare rug like grasping fingers. Bottles clinked softly as Mark shifted in his armchair, the worn leather creaking under his weight, like a reluctant confession dragged from the depths. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers tracing the rim of a half-empty glass, the amber liquid inside catching the dim light in fractured, wavering glints that mirrored the unease in her eyes. Elena leaned forward, elbows on her knees, the rough wool of her sweater bunching at her shoulders, scratching faintly against her skin. Her eyes, dark and shadowed by invisible burdens, fixed on the worn floorboards as if they held the crushing weight of unspoken histories etched in every grain. It started with that boy in the library, quiet, always buried in books. He lent me a volume of poetry, his hand brushing mine. Nothing grand, just a spark. But when he walked away the next day without a word, I felt it crack open inside me, like I'd handed over a piece of myself and gotten only silence in return. Now, every time someone gets close, I wait for that emptiness. It's easier to push them away first. Mark's laugh came low, a hollow rumble that echoed without reaching his eyes, carrying the faint bitterness of old whiskey on his breath. He swirled the liquor in his tumbler, ice cubes rattling like distant warnings in the still air. Independence clung to him like the faint, oily scent of engine grease on his shirt, remnants of solitary nights in the garage, alone with his tools and unspoken doubts. Safe? That's a myth people whisper to themselves in the dark. He set the glass down with deliberate force, the thud reverberating in the close, stifling air. Mine was a girl from college, all fire and endless plans. We drove cross-country once, windows down, her laughter filling the cab like fleeting sunlight. But when she started talking forever, I saw the cage closing in. I left her at a gas station in Nevada, told her I needed space. Haven't looked back. Commitment? It's just chains disguised as comfort. I keep my distance, and that's how I stay free. Sarah's gaze lingered on Mark a beat too long, her smile tight and strained, fingers stilling on the glass as jealousy twisted low in her gut, unspoken and sharp. She wanted to shield them from this unraveling, to weave their stories into something whole, but her chest tightened with the pull of her own buried ache, the air growing heavier around her. You both make it sound so final, she said softly, her voice a fragile bridge between their fractures, trembling slightly. Like those moments define the end instead of the beginning. My first was subtle, a classmate who shared my sketches, saw the mess I hid in lines and colors. He said I was brilliant, and for a night, I believed it. Then he ghosted, left me staring at blank pages. Now I pour it all into watching out for you two, making sure no one else gets that scar. But sometimes, it feels like I'm the one still bleeding. The silence stretched, thick and probing, broken only by the faint, insistent hum of the radiator in the corner, its warmth doing little to ease the chill of exposure. Elena's breath hitched, her guarded posture curling inward, as if the words had peeled back too much skin, raw and stinging. Mark stared at his hands, knuckles whitening around nothing, the detachment cracking just enough to let unease seep through like cold draft. Sarah met their eyes, her supportive facade wavering, the room's oppression mirroring the quiet dread blooming between them. Longing tangled with the fear of what lay exposed, hearts pounding in the dim confines. The haze of smoke clung like unspoken doubts, Elena's whisper fading into the walnut wall's unyielding embrace, their dark grains absorbing every echo. Hours blurred in the room's stifling vigil, the circle's gaze shifting to Clara, her fingers absently sifting through a forgotten drawer of mementos as her own tale took shape, the faint rustle of paper underscoring the tension. Suspicion stirred in the melancholic gloom, a buried longing uncoiling like a shadow, ready to pierce the veil of years. But it never does it? Not really. Mark's voice cut through the dimness, low and edged with something brittle, like glass underfoot, crunching softly in the mind. He leaned back in the sagging armchair, arms crossed tight over his chest, the fabric of his shirt pulling taut against his ribs, straining with restrained breath. The walnut panels seemed to lean closer, their grains twisting like veins in the lamplight's sickly glow, trapping the scent of stale smoke and forgotten dinners in a suffocating veil. Sarah shifted on the worn sofa beside Lucas, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater, eyes flicking to Mark before settling on the floor, where shadows pooled like spilled ink. She wanted to reach out, to smooth the tension etching lines around his mouth, but the words stuck, tangled in the jealousy she wouldn't name, its bitterness rising like bile. "Elena, that sounds raw," she said softly, her tone a bridge offered too late, voice fading into the heavy air. "What made you see it that way?" Across from them, Lucas tilted his head, his gaze sharp as a scalpel, dissecting the air between confessions with clinical precision. He craved these unravelings, the way emotions peeled back layers like old paint. But his own pulse quickened at the thought of his friends slipping away into their silences, leaving him adrift. "It's those first cracks," he murmured, analytical hunger lacing his words, steady yet probing. "The moments we don't notice until they're walls." The circle widened as Clara, who had been quiet in the corner shadows, pulled a crumpled envelope from her coat pocket, the paper crinkling faintly in the hush. Her hands paused, hovering over the yellowed paper, as if the weight of it might pull her under into forgotten depths. She had meant to share a simple story, a fleeting glance in a crowded cafe, the spark that soured into solitude. But the letter had tumbled out with her keys earlier, unearthed from a drawer she hadn't touched in years, its edges frayed like nerves. Now, in this stifling room, it burned against her palm, warm and insistent. "I found this today," Clara said, her voice fracturing like thin ice under pressure, cracking softly. She unfolded it slowly, the paper whispering against itself, ink faded but insistent. Words of promises from a lover long gone, scrawled in a hand that pleaded for forever. The scent of old perfume clung to it, faint and floral, stirring dust motes into lazy spirals that danced in the dim light. Reading aloud, her words trembled. "You are the ache I carry, the one I can't let go." It was nothing, really, just a summer fling, but it made me build everything after it to keep the pain out. Mark's eyes narrowed, suspicion coiling in his gut like smoke, thick and choking. Who kept something like that? Who dragged ghosts into this room, forcing them all to stare at their own buried hurts, the air growing heavier with each breath? He shifted, boots scraping the rug with a rough rasp, independence his shield against the pull he felt toward Sarah's quiet concern. Her presence a faint warmth in the cold. "Sounds like you're romanticizing regret," he said, detached. But his voice held an undercurrent of wariness, as if the letter might expose his own unspoken yearnings, raw and pulsing. Sarah's smile faltered, her drive to nurture the group clashing with the sting of envy. Clara's vulnerability drawing Lucas's focused stare, while Mark walled himself off again, his silhouette stark against the wall. She leaned forward, conflicted warmth in her eyes, the faint scent of her lavender soap cutting through the smoke. "It's brave to share that, Clara, but does it still hurt the same?" Lucas nodded, probing deeper, his fear of abandonment masked in curiosity, voice steady but edged with hunger. "That letter, it's a fracture point. What if it's not buried longing, but something unfinished? Suspicious, how we hide these things, only for them to resurface." Clara folded the letter, tucking it away with a soft crinkle. But the longing lingered in the air, oppressive as the lamp's relentless flicker. Its buzz a low drone in the ears. The room held its breath, walls pressing in, each participant glancing sidelong, suspicion blooming like shadows at dusk, questioning not just the words, but the silences they guarded, heavy and profound. Mark met Sarah's gaze for a beat too long, then looked away, the fracture widening unseen, a silent rift in the dimness. The echo of Mark's brittle words lingered in the dim room, pressing against Clara's chest like an unyielding fog, damp and suffocating. Hours slipped by in the oppressive hush of night, her thoughts a contemplative spiral through fractured memories, laced with a deep, fearful longing that clawed at the edges of her mind. The emotional walls she'd fortified felt more confining than ever, shadows of her past stirring restlessly in the corners. Trembling fingers hovered over her phone, the pull toward confrontation growing inexorable, a melancholic tide eroding her hesitation with relentless whispers. "Why did you let it slip away like that?" Elena's voice pierced the hush, her words aimed at Mark across the cluttered coffee table, where half-empty mugs steamed faintly in the lamplight, their herbal scent fading into bitterness. Mark shifted in the armchair, his gaze dropping to the frayed rug beneath his boots, threads worn thin like nerves. The room, with its peeling wallpaper and the faint scent of stale incense clinging to the curtains like a veil, pressed in like an uninvited witness, watching every twitch. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater, eyes flicking between them with quiet intensity. She wanted to steer this back, to wrap her friends in the safety of shared stories, but the knot in her chest tightened. Jealousy, unbidden, at the raw edge in Elena's tone, echoing her own buried ache for Mark, sharp as a thorn. Lucas leaned against the wall, arms folded, his analytical stare dissecting the moment with unblinking focus. He craved these depths, the unraveling of hearts like threads pulled loose, yet the fear gnawed at him. What if this honesty left him stranded, alone in the echo of their confessions, the silence ringing hollow? "It's not about letting go," he interjected softly, voice measured, probing like a needle. "Those first sparks, they're the cracks where the walls start forming." "What was yours, Elena? The one that made you build yours so high?" Elena's breath caught, her hands clenching in her lap, knuckles paling against the fabric. She had come here tonight, drawn by the pull of their circle, but now the air thickened with expectation, heavy as damp fog. Fear coiled in her gut, sharp and insistent, the terror of peeling back layers, of inviting hurt through the door she'd slammed shut years ago, its echo still reverberating. Her former lover, Alex, lingered in her mind like a half-forgotten melody, the one who'd whispered promises in the dim glow of a seaside cafe, only to vanish when vulnerability turned to need, leaving salt on her tongue. Confronting him now, sending that message she'd typed and deleted a dozen times, felt like stepping onto fracturing ice, cold and treacherous. But wasn't that the fracture they were chasing? The small betrayals that birthed these barriers, brick by jealous brick. I think it was the night we danced," she murmured finally, her voice threading through the oppressive quiet like smoke, faint and drifting. The memory bloomed, the salt-tanged breeze off the water, Alex's hand warm on her waist, laughter bubbling until his eyes shuddered at her confession of doubt, a subtle shift like a door closing. That insignificant hesitation had seeded her walls, growing in the dark. Sarah nodded, supportive, yet her own shadow stirred, Mark's easy smile earlier, directed at Elena, twisting the knife of her unspoken longing, deep and insistent. She reached out, squeezing Elena's knee gently. "Sharing it breaks it a little, doesn't it?" But Elena shook her head, pulling her phone from her pocket with trembling resolve, the cool glass slick against her skin. The screen's glow cast harsh shadows on her face, illuminating the guarded fear in her eyes, wide and haunted. Lucas watched, fascinated yet uneasy, his drive to dissect warring with the dread of abandonment if she shattered too completely, pieces scattering like glass. "I'm doing it," Elena whispered, thumbs hovering before typing. "It's been too long. Can we talk?" She hit send, the whoosh of the message a fracture in the silence, releasing a wave of terror that hung between them. Vulnerability exposed, connection beckoned, walls teetering on the edge of collapse, the air humming with anticipation. Sarah's heart raced in sympathy, her protective instinct flaring even as jealousy whispered doubts, cold fingers on her spine. Lucas exhaled slowly, analyzing the shift, but feeling the group's fragile intimacy strain under the weight, threads pulling taut. The room seemed smaller, the melancholic longing for what might heal them now, laced with the sharp sting of what could wound deeper. Breath shallow in the dim. The silence stretched like a shadow after her words. Mark's averted eyes mirroring the regret pooling in Elena's chest, dark and viscous. Hours blurred into a restless night, the room's oppressive air clinging to her skin like a second layer, damp and unyielding, as unspoken longings clawed at her thoughts with relentless fingers. By dawn, alone with the dim glow of her phone, her fingers hovered, then pressed, send. The message a fragile thread unraveling hidden wounds, its echo fading into the gray light. In that instant, the weight descended, stirring echoes of buried secrets among them all, a quiet dread settling like dust. Mark traced the rim of his mug with a calloused fingertip, the ceramic cool against his skin, roughened by years of solitude, as Elena's question lingered like smoke in the dim room, curling slowly. Steam curled lazily from the untouched coffee, carrying a bitter edge that mirrored the twist in his gut, sharp and unrelenting. He met her eyes, dark pools edged with accusation, and let out a slow breath, the sound rasping against the silence, dry as old leaves. "I didn't let it slip," he said, voice low and edged with deflection. Words measured like steps on thin ice. "You pushed it. Remember that night in the diner? You kept circling back to futures, plans, like I was some puzzle you could lock into place." His words spilled out, deliberate, each one a barrier rebuilt in the air between them. But beneath the detachment, a flicker stirred, that buried ache for her warmth, the one he shoved down deeper than regret, pulsing faintly. Independence was his armor, yet here, in this circle of worn chairs and flickering bulb, it chafed like ill-fitted chainmail, heavy and restrictive. Elena leaned forward, her fingers curling around the edge of the table, nails biting into scarred wood with a faint scrape. The group's eyes, Lucas's sharp, probing gaze included, pressed on her, amplifying the knot in her chest, tight and throbbing. She wanted to bridge the gap, to pull him close despite the scars of past hurts, jagged and tender. But fear coiled tighter, whispering of exposure, of another fall into the void. "Pushed? You vanished after that. No call, no trace." Her voice cracked, a fragile thread in the oppressive hush, fraying at the edges. In a surge of raw impulse, she yanked her phone from her jeans pocket, thumb flying across the screen with frantic taps. The message typed itself in haste. "Why did you let it go?" She hit send before doubt could claw it back, the soft chime slicing the air like a confession, sharp and final. The notification buzzed on Mark's device, vibrating against his thigh with insistent urgency. He froze, the sound pulling threads from his carefully woven isolation, unraveling slowly. Around the table, the shift ripened, unspoken weights settling heavier, like stones in still water. Lucas shifted in his seat, the creak of leather echoing his inner churn, a low groan. He analyzed their exchange with clinical hunger, dissecting the intimacy's fragile veins. Yet his own fear gnawed. What if his probing drove them all away, leaving him adrift in echoes that rang hollow? The room's stale incense thickened, mingling with the faint metallic tang of tension, pressing walls inward as if to squeeze out hidden truths, the air growing dense. Elena's phone stayed clutched in her palm, warm from her grip, but the send had unleashed something irrevocable. A bridge extended into void, trembling. Longing bloomed in her chest, melancholic and insistent, for the connection she'd sabotaged before it could wound her again, its absence a dull throb. Mark stared at his screen, thumb hovering, the words blurring into memories of tangled sheets and whispered promises he'd fled, their warmth now cold. He typed a reply, because staying meant losing myself, then deleted it, the deletion a small violence against the pull he denied, fingers trembling slightly. Lucas cleared his throat, leaning in with feigned neutrality, the sound rough in the quiet. That push, it's the same instinct we all fight, wanting closeness, but armoring up first. His tone probed, analytical, yet laced with his own shadowed obsession. To mend their fractures without facing his abandonment's shadow, dark and looming. The unease rippled outward, a collective tide of regrets surfacing, missed calls, unspoken pleas, the slow erosion of bonds like waves on stone. Elena's eyes drifted to Mark's, holding there in silent plea, the air between them thick with what might have been, heavy and expectant. No one spoke further. The silence stretched, contemplative and heavy, each breath a reminder of desires guarded too fiercely, connections fraying under the weight of self-preservation, threads whispering in the dim. Hours bled into the shadowed hush of night, the tension between Mark and Elena coiling tighter in the dim room's oppressive grip, like vines strangling a frame. Across town, in the stale air of her solitary apartment, Clara wrestled with echoes of abandonment, her pulse a melancholic thrum against the silence, steady yet sorrowful. Regret pooled like ink in her chest, drawing her hand to the phone, fingers tracing old messages, each one a fragile thread of longing, faded and worn. She pressed send, vulnerability laid bare in the contemplative dark, unaware of the fracture awaiting, its shadow creeping closer. The curt reply sliced through the steam, leaving Elena's words to dissolve unanswered in the heavy air, fading like mist. She stared at her phone screen, the glow casting sharp shadows across her knuckles, white from gripping the edge of the table, nails digging in. Mark's text, 3 words, flat as slate. Not now, Elena. Hung there, unblinking, while the bitter coffee scent clawed at her throat, acrid and unrelenting. In the dim interview room, the recorder's red light pulsed like a distant heartbeat, indifferent to the fracture, its steady blink a cold witness. Sarah shifted in her chair beside Elena, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater, eyes flicking between them with quiet concern. She had urged Elena to reach out, hadn't she? Just last week, over late-night wine, Sarah had painted it simple. One message, a bridge back to what they almost had, the glasses clinking softly. But now, watching Elena's face crumple inward, Sarah felt the twist of her own unspoken ache, the jealousy coiling tighter, a serpent in her gut. Elena set the phone down, deliberate, as if it burned her skin. Her voice emerged soft, frayed at the edges, when the interviewer prompted her to continue. It was supposed to fix things. After the fight, the one where he walked out without a word, I thought, maybe if I admitted I was scared, that I pushed too hard because I wanted it so much. She paused, tracing the scar on her thumb, a faint line from a shattered vase months ago, hurled in that same blind rage against closeness, its jagged edge still sharp in memory. The memory flooded back, Mark's silhouette in the doorway, shoulders rigid, the door clicking shut like a final verdict, echoing in the empty space. She'd chased him then, too, her pleas echoing in the empty hall, unanswered. Mark leaned back, arms crossed over his chest, the leather of the chair creaking under him like a sigh. He avoided her gaze, fixing instead on the peeling wallpaper, its faded pattern a map of neglect, curling at the edges. I told her straight, he said, his tone clipped, defensive walls rising like blinds drawn against dawn, swift and impenetrable. Independence was his armor, commitment the trap he dodged with practiced ease, steps light but weary. Yet beneath it, unacknowledged, stirred that buried pull toward her. The way her laugh once unraveled his solitude, warm and fleeting. He shoved it down, deeper. I need space. Always have. Getting too close. It suffocates. Sarah cleared her throat, her supportive smile fracturing at the corners, faint lines of strain. She placed a hand on Elena's arm, light as a confession withheld, skin warm against fabric. You were brave to try, she murmured, but the words tasted hollow, laced with her fear of peering into her own heart, raw and unguarded. What if she admitted it? The nights she'd lingered after group hangs, hoping Mark's detachment might crack for her. A sliver of light. Jealousy gnawed now, quiet and relentless, as Elena's vulnerability exposed the raw edges of her own desires, unresolved, festering like an open wound. The room pressed in, walls echoing the weight of missteps. Elena's sabotage, born of terror, cold and gripping. Mark's retreat a shield for his hidden longing, veiled. Sarah's mediation a veil over envy, thin and tearing. Elena's eyes glistened, not with tears, but the sting of regret, sharp as exposed nerves, prickling. She'd bared herself again, only to watch the connection splinter further. The hope she'd nurtured now shards in her chest, cutting deep. In the silence that followed, the recorder whirred on, capturing the escalation. Their stories weaving tighter, pulling them toward the brink where protection warred with yearning, relentless and unyielding. The sting of Mark's dismissal lingered like fog in Elena's chest, bleeding into the long hours that followed, slow and heavy. By evening, the oppressive dusk had settled over the city, mirroring the melancholy that now gripped Clara in her shadowed alcove, gray light filtering through cracked blinds. Her fingers trembled against a half-empty glass, the air thick with the ache of isolation, stirring a desperate undercurrent of longing that begged for release, voice in the silence. The glass shattered against the tile floor, shards skittering like fleeing insects across the interview room's dim expanse, glinting coldly. Sarah froze mid-sip, her mug hovering inches from her lips, as the fragments caught the overhead light in jagged gleams, sharp and accusing. Mark had flung it, his hand still arched in the aftermath, veins stark against his paling skin, after Lucas's latest probe sliced too close. And what if independence is just fear wearing a mask? Silence clawed back in, thicker now, laced with the acrid tang of spilled herbal tea soaking into the grout, steaming faintly. Mark slumped into his chair, rubbing his temple, as if to erase the outburst, his eyes fixed on the table's scarred wood, grooves like old wounds. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears, a dull rhythm echoing the fracture she'd just witnessed, mirroring the one splintering inside her, cracks widening. The room's walls, papered in faded beige, seemed to lean inward, compressing the air until each breath tasted of dust and unspoken regrets, dry and choking. Lucas leaned forward, elbows on knees, his gaze steady and dissecting, like a surgeon pausing before the incision, scalpel poised. That hit something, he said softly, not accusing, but inviting the bleed, voice calm yet insistent. His voice carried that analytical lilt, probing for the emotional strata beneath, even as his own fingers twisted the hem of his shirt. A tell of the abandonment he dreaded, the fear that these confessions might leave him adrift in their wake, waves crashing. Sarah's chest tightened. She'd come here to shield them all, to weave support around Mark's walls and Lucas's endless questions. Anything to keep their fragile trio intact, threads binding. But watching Mark retreat further, his shoulders a fortress against the vulnerability Lucas unearthed, stirred the jealousy she'd buried deep, now rising hot. It burned now, hot and unbidden, fueled by the despair of loving someone who bolted at the first shadow of closeness, dark and encroaching. Her throat worked, dry as the room's stale recirculated air, and before she could swallow it back, the words erupted. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, the confession ripping free like a thread pulled too taut, snapping. Her voice cracked, raw edges scraping the quiet, painful. "Mark, every time you push away, like with Elena, like now, it's killing me. I want to fix it for you, for all of us. But God, I want you. And it terrifies me. Because what if admitting that traps me in the same cage you're running from? I'm jealous of her texts, of anyone who gets even a sliver of what I ache for. The admission hung there, pulsing with the weight of years unspoken, heavy as lead. Mark's head snapped up, his eyes widening, not with anger, but a flicker of something haunted, the shadow of his own buried longing, surfacing like bile, bitter. He opened his mouth, then closed it, defensive walls cracking under the pressure, fissures appearing. Sarah, I didn't... But the words faltered, his independence fracturing against the truth she'd hurled into the light, blinding. He leaned back, detached no longer, but exposed, the fear of entrapment coiling visibly in his rigid frame, muscles tense. Lucas exhaled slowly, his curiosity sharpening into something pained, his drive to plumb these depths now laced with the dread of watching bonds unravel, threads snapping one by one. It's all connected, he murmured, voice contemplative, tracing invisible lines between them in the air. We chase intimacy, but shield ourselves until it breaks everything else. His eyes darted between them, analytical hunger warring with the ache of potential loss, as the room's oppressive hush deepened, wrapping their sadness in layers of unrelenting gray, suffocating. Sarah's gaze dropped to the shattered glass, tears blurring the edges into a mournful mosaic, shimmering. The longing settled heavy in her bones, a melancholic tide pulling them under, each confession escalating the invisible fractures until protection felt like the cruelest isolation, chains of their own making. In the suffocating hush that swallowed the shard's echo, isolation coiled tighter around them like unseen chains, each face turning inward amid the interview room's oppressive gloom, light dim and unforgiving. Mark's outburst hung in the air, a fracture widening into chasms of unhealed wounds, as the weight of buried revelations pressed relentlessly, urging the fragile group toward an unraveling they could no longer evade, inevitable. I can't hold this together anymore. Sarah's mind fractures like the mug's remnants, her pulse hammering against the sudden silence that swallows Mark's outburst, echoing. The sharp scent of spilled coffee rises, bitter and acrid, mingling with the metallic tang of fear in her throat, choking. She sets the mug down carefully, too carefully, her fingers brushing the table's scarred wood, grounding herself as shards crunch underfoot when she shifts, gritty and painful. Lucas leans forward, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, dissecting the wreckage without flinching, gaze steady. See? That's the mask cracking, he says, voice steady, probing deeper into the void Mark just vacated, storming out with a slam that echoes like a final judgment, door rattling. But Lucas doesn't chase. He turns to Elena, who huddles in the corner chair, arms wrapped tight around her knees, her breath coming in shallow hitches, ragged. Elena, you feel it too, the way independence isolates us, doesn't it? Pretending we're whole when we're just empty. Elena's laugh cracks, brittle as autumn leaves under boots, crunching dryly, and she uncurls just enough to meet his gaze, her dark curls falling like a veil she can't quite hide behind, tangled. Empty? You think that's news? Her words spill out, laced with venom she didn't know she carried, her drive for connection twisting into something feral, sharp. She's always guarded, building walls brick by jealous brick, but now they crumble under the weight of his relentless curiosity, stones tumbling. You poke and prod like we're specimens, Lucas, fixing us while you sit there, untouched. What if I told you I sabotage everything? Because getting close means losing it all. Like with him. She jerks her head toward the door, where Mark's shadow lingers in memory, fading. Or anyone. Vulnerability? It's a trap. I'd rather be alone than bleed for you. The room presses in, walls of faded beige closing like a coffin lid. The hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead flickering in rhythm with Sarah's unraveling thoughts, erratic. She wants to protect them. Elena from her own thorns, Lucas from his endless unraveling of souls. But the jealousy coils tighter in her chest, unresolved, a shadow whispering Mark's name, insistent. Stop, Sarah murmurs, her voice barely threading through the tension. But it gains no traction. Her hands clench the table's edge, nails digging into splintered grain, rough, as the supportive facade she wears frays at the seams, threads pulling. Internally, she screams, "Why can't I admit I want him too? That happiness for them means my own ache." Lucas recoils, just a fraction, enough to betray the fear flickering in his analytical core, eyes widening briefly. His drive to explore intimacy falters. What if his questions drive them away, leaving him adrift in the silence he dreads? Vast. "I'm not untouched," he counters, softer now, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on his knee. A tick betraying the obsession to mend what he can't fix in himself. Loops endless. "I analyze because if I don't, the abandonment hits harder. We're all hiding, aren't we? Behind drives that keep us safe, but so damn alone." Chaos erupts in whispers, turning to shouts. Elena rising to pace, her footsteps grinding glass into finer dust. Each crunch a accusation, sharp. Sarah stands too, torn between pulling them close and fleeing her own mirrored fears. Jealousy that isolates her from the very happiness she craves, elusive. Revelations spiral. Elena's sabotage laid bare. Lucas's obsession cracking his composure. Sarah's conflict bubbling up in a choked sob she swallows back, throat tight. Healing isn't words, it's this raw plunge into pain, the oppressive weight of truths that bind them, yet carve deeper divides, knives turning. In the end, they sit amid the debris, breaths sinking in uneasy truce, each nursing the isolation that vulnerability demands they face alone, together. The longing lingers, a melancholic echo in the dim light, contemplative pauses stretching like wounds that refuse to close, bleeding slowly. 3 days blurred into a haze of fractured reflections, Sarah's mind ensnaring her in the echo of shattered porcelain and unspoken accusations, ringing. The bitter coffee stain lingered on the table like a bruise, mirroring the ache in her chest. A relentless longing for cohesion amid unraveling truths, pulling apart. Sleep offered no respite, only oppressive shadows that deepened the unease coiling within. Dark tendrils. Now, as the group gathered once more, the air thickened with betrayal's weight, vulnerabilities hovering like ghosts in the dim light, pulling them inexorably toward confrontation. Steps heavy. That's when Lucas realized the fragility of their circle, how Clara's confession 3 days ago had cracked the foundation they all pretended was solid, fissures hidden. He sat at the edge of the worn leather couch in Elena's dimly lit living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen underscoring the silence like a distant heartbeat, monotonous. The air carried the stale residue of takeout from their last uneasy gathering, soy sauce and regret, clinging to the curtains that never quite blocked the streetlight's intrusive glow, orange and flickering. Elena paced near the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines of forgotten novels, each step a measured denial of the knot twisting in her chest. Tight. She wanted to reach out, to let the words spill and bind them closer. But the fear gnawed deeper. One slip, and she'd pull away again, just as she always did when love loomed too near, threatening. "We can't keep pretending," she said finally, her voice a fragile thread, quivering. "Clara bared everything, and now it's like we're all waiting for the next fracture." Mark leaned against the wall by the window, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the scuffed hardwood floor, grains worn smooth. The anxiety coiled in his gut, urging him to bolt. Yet something pulled him back, a buried ache for connection he couldn't name, insistent. Commitment felt like chains, but solitude echoed louder now, amplified by Clara's unraveling, its sound hollow. He shifted, the floor creaking under his weight, protesting. Pretending what? That we're not all messed up? She spilled her guts, and it changes nothing for us. Lucas felt the weight settle heavier on his shoulders, his mind racing to dissect their words, to mend the rifts before they widened, seams splitting. But overwhelm blurred the edges. His own abandonment loomed in every pause, a shadow whispering that if he fixed them, they'd stay, binding. He opened his mouth to respond, to offer the analysis that had always been his armor, but the words caught, splintering into something raw, jagged. His breath hitched, and suddenly the room tilted. "I can't." Lucas's voice broke, not in anger, but in a quiet unraveling, his hands pressing into his thighs as if to anchor himself, fabric bunching. Tears welled unbidden, hot tracks down his cheeks, exposing the desperation he'd buried under layers of concern, deep. "I keep trying to hold us together, to understand why you're pulling away, Elena, or why you fight this so hard, Mark. But what if you all leave? What if I'm the one who can't be fixed?" The confession hung there, stripped and aching, his body folding forward as sobs shook him, contemplative no longer, just a man, laid bare, trembling. Elena stopped pacing, her hopeful flicker dimming into conflict as she watched him crumble, shoulders heaving. She stepped closer, hand hovering near his shoulder, the urge to embrace warring with the instinct to retreat, fingers twitching. Vulnerability terrified her, yet his pain mirrored her own sabotage, forcing her to confront the love she craved and feared. Duel. "Lucas," she whispered, voice laced with longing, but unease threaded through it, a reminder that closeness could shatter, glass-like. Mark's arms dropped, his anxiety spiking into something sharper, unease settling like frost in his veins, cold. He saw his reflection in Lucas's breakdown, the denied hunger for this messy bond, the terror of being ensnared, traps closing. Pushing off the wall, he moved nearer, not touching, but present, shadow lengthening. "We're not going anywhere," he muttered, the words tasting foreign, a tentative step toward the commitment he dreaded, hesitant. Yet doubt lingered, thick and oppressive, as the room pulsed with their shared, unspoken fears, the air tasting of salt and unspoken betrayals, briny. The silence clung like damp rot, Lucas's realization festering into a quiet suspicion that poisoned the air, subtle toxin. Days slipped by in oppressive twilight, the group's unspoken fractures widening, each member haunted by Clara's confession, a ghost whispering of betrayals yet to unfold, murmurs in the dark. In the dim haze of another gathering, the weight of their shared longing pressed down, stirring a desperate urge to salvage what remained, even as doubts coiled tighter in the shadows, serpentine. The faint scratch of pen on paper yanked Elena back, her father's voice, gravelly over the phone line 8 years ago, promising he'd return from the deployment, then the dial tone swallowing everything, abrupt. She blinked, the living room's dim lamplight pulling her into the present, where the group huddled around the low coffee table strewn with notebooks and half-empty mugs of cooling tea, porcelain clinking faintly. The steam from Mark's cup had long dissipated, leaving a bitter herbal scent that clung to the air like unspoken regrets, lingering. Clara, perched on the arm of the couch beside Lucas, cleared her throat softly, the sound rustling in the quiet. "We can't just sit here unraveling," she said, her voice threading through the quiet like a tentative stitch, careful. "Let's try something structured. Write a letter to your future self. Pour in your fears, your hopes. No judgments. It might mend things." She passed out the blank pages, her eyes lingering on Elena with a flicker of concern. But Elena only nodded, gripping the pen tighter, her knuckles paling against the wood, tense. Mark shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under him like a warning. Low groan. He glanced at Sarah across the table, her gaze already fixed on him. Too steady, too searching, probing. Was that pity in her eyes? Or something sharper, like envy? He uncapped his pen, but the words wouldn't come. Ink hovering. Commitment. The word loomed in his mind, a shadow he couldn't outrun, pursuing. What if this exercise exposed him, laid bare that buried ache for connection he pretended didn't exist, hidden deep? His hand hovered, then scrawled a single line. "You'll be free by then, won't you?" But freedom felt hollow, a lie he told himself to keep the longing at bay, echoing empty. Sarah watched them both, her own paper curling slightly under her fingertips from the dampness of her palm, sweat beading. She wanted to support this, to lean into the empathy that had always been her armor. Yet suspicion coiled in her chest like smoke, hazy. Elena's hopeful glances toward Mark. Did they hide a sabotage waiting to bloom, thorns ready? And Mark, always pulling back just as she dared to voice her needs, retreating. Was he truly engaging, or just performing for the room, mask in place? Her pen moved haltingly. Future me, don't let them see how much you still want what you can't have. Jealousy whispered beneath it, unresolved, making her fear her own desires feel like betrayal, stinging. Elena wrote in bursts, the ink bleeding where her hand pressed too hard, spots dark. Vulnerability, love. The words tangled, her drive to embrace it warring with the terror of hurt, internal storm. But as the minutes stretched, the room's oppression thickened. The tick of the wall clock, the faint mustiness of old bookshelves pressing in, dusty. She thought of the fractures Clara's confession had exposed 3 days prior, how Lucas's silence now mirrored her own facade, reflecting. Suddenly, the pen slipped, and a sob escaped, raw and unbidden, throat tight. "I can't," she whispered, crumpling the page. Tears streaked her face, smudging the ink into dark blooms, blurring. "Every time I get close, I ruin it. I push them away because what if they stay and it breaks me?" Mark froze, his anxious scribbles forgotten, pen still. Her breakdown pierced him, stirring that denied desire for love he kept chained, rattling. Was this what commitment meant? Witnessing the cracks in others and feeling your own widen, spreading? Sarah reached out, her hand trembling not from fear, but from the suspicion that her jealousy had blinded her to this shared fragility, veiled. "Elena," she murmured, voice laced with longing. "We're all breaking. Maybe that's the point." The letters lay unfinished, confessions half-formed, as the group's reflections deepened into a melancholic hush, each suspecting the shadows in their own hearts mirrored the others. Dark twins. The dim lamplight cast elongated shadows across the notebooks, where faded ink whispered of promises unkept. Much like the ones Elena still mourned, faint echoes. A contemplative silence enveloped the group, heavy with unspoken longings, as hands trembled toward the letters. The air grew oppressive, laced with a budding fear that coiled in their chests, drawing them inexorably into the melancholic unraveling of secrets, poised to fracture fragile bonds, threads straining. The ink on the letter blurred under Mark's thumb, its faint metallic tang rising like a buried regret as he unfolded it with unsteady hands, paper crinkling. Sarah leaned forward, her breath catching the steam from her mug, now just a ghost of warmth against her palms, fading. The circle of 3, Mark, her, Lucas, had tightened around the coffee table, notebooks splayed like confessions waiting to spill, pages open. Lucas's eyes, shadowed by exhaustion, flicked between them, his fingers tracing the edge of his own letter as if it might unravel him first, edges frayed. "Read it," Sarah said softly, her voice a thread in the dim lamplight, empathetic yet laced with the weight of her own unspoken needs, heavy. She wanted to support them, to hold space for their truths, but the knot in her chest whispered of her fear, facing the desire she'd buried to keep everyone safe, isolated in her careful boundaries, walls high. Mark cleared his throat, the sound rough as gravel underfoot, scraping. His anxiety churned, a storm he could no longer outrun. Confronting commitment meant staring down the trap he dreaded, even as his shadow hungered for the love he'd denied, gnawing. "All right," he murmured, voice low. To Sarah, "For years I've watched you from the edges, fixing what I could for everyone else, but never admitting how you light the fractures in me. I love you, not as a friend, not as the one who analyzes and mends, truly. And it terrifies me you'll leave if I say it aloud." Lucas's words hung there, read in Mark's halting tone, but they were his, penned in the quiet hours before this gathering, when his drive to focus on emotional needs had cracked open his own, splitting. Overwhelmed, he met Sarah's gaze, introspective shadows deepening in his eyes, pools dark. His fear of abandonment clawed at him now, raw and exposed. He'd obsessed over fixing their pains to bind them close. But this confession laid bare his isolation, the boundaries he'd built that kept love just out of reach. Teasing. Sarah's heart stuttered, a flush creeping up her neck. Not just from the revelation, but from the jealousy it ignited, sharp as shattered glass, cutting. Her unresolved feelings for Mark surged, unbidden, twisting into envy at Lucas's boldness, green and bitter. Why him, now, when she'd spent years supporting them both? Denying her own longing to avoid the chaos of desire, turbulent. She reached out, touching Lucas's wrist, her empathy a reflex, but her voice trembled. "Lucas, I didn't know. That's brave." Mark's grip tightened on the paper, crumpling its edge with a faint rustle. The words echoed his own buried truth, a festering ache for Sarah he'd never voiced, hidden behind his fear of entrapment, locked. Jealousy bloomed in him, hot and unfamiliar, fueling the anxiety that made his pulse thunder, loud in ears. He'd engaged tonight to confront this, but the rivalry surfacing now pressed like a weight on his chest, exposing the regret of missed chances, poignant. You mean that?" he asked Lucas, his tone edged with accusation, eyes darting to Sarah as if she might slip away, vanishing. The air between them thickened, oppressive with the unsaid, each breath a contemplative drag against the melancholic pull of what they'd lost to their self-made walls, barriers unyielding. Lucas nodded, voice barely above a whisper, his introspection fracturing under the fear, cracking. "I've fixed everything but this, and now, I don't know if it's too late." His hands shook, not from cold, but from the terror of the void opening wider, their isolation mirroring his own, vast. Sarah pulled back, the mug's porcelain cool against her skin, her empathy warring with the longing that scared her most, primal. The truths exposed them all, regrets like ink stains, boundaries that promised safety but delivered only echoes, hollow. Fear coiled in the silence, a dark psychological thread binding them, as the lamplight flickered, casting long shadows over the half-empty mugs and the letters that had finally spoken, voices rising. Hours bled into the dim hours after midnight, the letters' secrets uncoiling like shadows in their minds, stirring a hollow ache that none could name, persistent. Mark's regret echoed in Sarah's chest, a longing for the unity they'd lost, fractured, while Lucas's gaze wandered to the door, as if expecting the past to barge in, uninvited. The air grew thicker, oppressive with unspoken fractures, until Clara's arrival shattered the fragile hush, her eyes burning with the weight of revelations too raw to contain, flames in the dark. The warmth that once bound their voices together, now absent, leaving only the chill of half-formed sentences in the dim lamplight, cold and stark. Sarah's gaze drifted to the empty chair where Mark had sat moments before, his sudden departure a shadow that clung to the room's edges, lingering. She traced the rim of her mug with a fingertip, the porcelain cool and unyielding, as if it mocked the heat her confessions had failed to summon, futile. Elena sat across from her, knees drawn up on the worn sofa, her notebook clutched like a shield, pages filled with ink that bled regrets she hadn't yet voiced, stains dark. Lucas hunched beside Sarah, his breath uneven, eyes fixed on the floor where dust motes swirled in lazy defiance of the stillness, drifting. "I can't do this anymore," Elena whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice underfoot, splintering. She flung her notebook onto the coffee table, where it landed with a dull thud, pages fluttering open to reveal scrawled lines of what-ifs and never-weres, chaotic. "Lucas, you sit there, dissecting us like we're puzzles you can solve. Your revelation about how you've always fixed everyone else to avoid your own mess. It's just another way to pull the strings." Lucas lifted his head slowly, his face paling under the oppressive weight of her words, blood draining. The air between them thickened, not with accusation alone, but with the ghosts of touches withheld, glances averted in the name of safety, phantoms. He had confessed first, his voice a low rumble earlier, admitting how his endless analysis of their pains, Sarah's quiet longings, Elena's guarded heart, had been his armor against the fear of being left behind, shield cracking. "Elena, I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" she cut in, leaning forward, her dark hair falling like a veil over eyes that shimmered with unshed tears, glistening. "Manipulate this? Make us bare our souls while you hide behind your insights? We've all built these walls, thinking they'd keep us safe. But look at us, isolated in this circle, chasing shadows of what we could have had." Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the raw edge of vulnerability she both craved and dreaded, her drive to embrace love warring with the instinct to shatter it before it could wound her, destructive. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing Elena's arm, a tentative bridge in the gathering fracture, light touch. Empathy swelled in her chest, self-aware now of her own buried needs, the ache for Mark's presence, the jealousy that twisted like thorns when she imagined him elsewhere, pricking. "We're all running from the same thing," she said softly, her voice laced with the melancholy of missed paths, sorrowful. "Those boundaries we set, they didn't protect us. They just left us longing for what we denied ourselves." Yet even as she spoke, her fear coiled tighter, the unresolved pull toward Mark making her words feel like half-truths, her support for them a mask over her isolation, thin. Lucas recoiled, his introspective haze shattering into overwhelm, pieces scattering. He wanted to fix this, to draw Elena back, to assure Sarah he wouldn't abandon them. But his shadow loomed, that obsessive urge to mend others, while his own emotional voids yawned wider, abyssal. "I'm not manipulating," he protested, voice rising then faltering, breaking. I see how we've all lost chances. Me, pushing you away by trying too hard. You, Elena, sabotaging before we get close. Sarah, holding back your heart." The confession hung, exposing the regrets. Opportunities squandered in the dim light of caution. Boundaries that had forged solitude instead of sanctuary, iron. Elena stood abruptly, the sofa creaking in protest, springs sighing, her conflicted hope curdling into something sharper, acid. "Then why does it feel like you're the one gaining from our pain?" The words lashed out, dividing the space between them. Sarah caught in the rift, her empathetic reach falling short, grasping. Lucas's eyes met hers for a fleeting second, filled with the terror of abandonment, before he looked away, the group splintering like fragile glass under the weight of truths too long concealed, shattering. In the ensuing quiet, the longing settled deep, a melancholic ache for the connections they had glimpsed but never grasped, the oppressive air pressing them toward revelations that promised no easy solace, burdens heavy. As the lamplight flickered, casting elongated shadows across the vacant chair, the chill seeped deeper into the room's bones, suffusing the air with an oppressive weight, dense. Sarah's lingering gaze fractured into a shared melancholy, each breath heavy with unspoken longings and the group's unraveling threads, fraying. In that contemplative drift, despair coiled tighter around them all, stirring buried fractures toward an inevitable unraveling, unstoppable. Outside, the distant rumble of a truck's engine faded into the night. Inside, Elena's breath rasped, shallow and insistent, cutting through the room's stifled hush, labored. She pushed back from the table, chair legs scraping wood like a reluctant confession, harsh. The lamplight caught the faint sheen of sweat on her upper lip, turning it silver, glistening. Lucas leaned forward, his fingers splayed on the tabletop, knuckles pale, as if anchoring himself against the pull of her unrest, gripping. "Elena, wait," he said, voice threaded with that familiar urgency, the one that dissected pain before it could settle, probing. But his eyes betrayed the overwhelm, pupils wide, chasing shadows he couldn't fix. Not this time. Not when his own regrets coiled tighter in his chest, squeezing. Across from him, Mark shifted, his chair creaking under the weight of his stillness, protesting. He had slipped back in moments ago, silent as a ghost reclaiming its space, the empty mug before him a relic of his aborted escape, cold. Now, anxiety etched lines around his mouth, but something flickered there too. A hesitant engagement, like a man testing the bars of his own cage, rattling. Elena's laugh escaped, brittle and edged with something raw, cracking. "You want me to stay? For what? More of this?" She gestured at the circle of them, the air thick with the scent of cooling coffee and unspoken fractures, bitter. Her hands trembled, not visibly, but in the way she clasped them, nails digging crescents into palms, stinging. Vulnerability clawed at her, that old fear of being cracked open, hurt again, exposing. Yet hope lingered in her posture, conflicted, pulling her toward the door even as it urged her to speak, torn. "I've kept this buried," she continued, words tumbling now, contemplative pauses stretching like wounds reopening, bleeding. "That relationship, the one I told you was just a fling, he promised everything. Nights tangled in sheets that smelled of salt and smoke, whispers that made me believe in forever. But it ended in betrayal, his hands on someone else while I waited in the dark, alone. I built walls after that, high ones, to keep safe. Sabotaged every closeness since, pushing until it broke." Her voice cracked, longing bleeding through the despair, eyes locking on Lucas first, then Mark, pleading. "And look at us. Our boundaries aren't shields, they're graves. We've isolated ourselves, missed every chance at real connection, all because we're terrified." Lucas swallowed, the sound audible in the oppression of the room, throat dry. His drive to tend others surged, but it warred with introspection, the fear of abandonment gnawing deeper, teeth sharp. "I do that too," he admitted, voice low, rhythmic in its hesitation, pulsing. "Analyze you both, fix your hurts, while mine fester. Regret every moment I didn't just feel." His gaze dropped, the weight of missed opportunities pressing like an unseen hand on his shoulder, heavy. Mark's breath hitched, his shadow stirring, the desire for love he buried under commitment's dread, surfacing. "Complicity," he murmured, engaging at last, anxious words laced with dawning truth, reluctant. "I've run from this, from us, because staying means risking the trap. But the real prison? It's this running. The regrets. They're what trap me." Elena's shoulders slumped, the melancholic pull of their shared exposure settling like dust after a collapse. "Fine." She rose fully, coat draped over one arm, the fabric whispering against her skin, soft. "I can't breathe here anymore. Not tonight." The door clicked open behind her, cool air rushing in, carrying the faint metallic tang of the street, sharp. She stepped out, leaving the echo of her secret to fracture the room, forcing them to face their own roles in the isolation, the painful truths that bound them in despair, regrets blooming like bruises under the dim light, purpled. 3 days dragged on in suffocating silence, the night's tension coiling tighter within the group like unspoken shadows, dark. Elena's restless vigil had dissolved into a weary haze for all, regrets festering beneath the surface, infected. In the dim confines of her apartment, Clara sat motionless, the weight of abandonment pressing down, her fingers tracing faded scars of memory, lines pale. Resignation settled over her like dusk, a melancholic ache that blurred the edges of resolve, until the phone's insistent vibration shattered the hush, summoning ghosts from the past, rattling chains. The dining room. Moments after Elena's chair scraped back, silence stretched like a frayed wire, taut. Elena's hand hovered over her water glass, fingers curling without lifting it. The liquid inside trembled faintly from the table's vibration, a small betrayal of the calm she clung to, ripples. Mark sat across from her, elbows planted on the scarred oak, his gaze fixed on the half-eaten remnants of dinner, cold pasta coiled like forgotten promises, congealing. Sarah leaned against the sideboard, arms crossed, her eyes tracing the shadows pooling under the lamp's frayed shade, deep. The room behind her seemed to contract, the walls pressing in with the scent of cooling garlic and spilled wine, heady. Mark shifted, his chair groaning softly. Sarah's posture stiffened, though neither spoke, tension thick. Elena's mind raced, images of tangled sheets, bitter arguments, The way he'd slipped away without a backward glance, vanishing. Vulnerability she'd buried, now clawing its way up, nails scraping. "Why now?" she murmured, voice barely above a whisper, laced with the ache of old wounds reopening, throbbing. "After everything?" A sigh filtered through the speaker, heavy with unspoken regrets, waited. "Because I can't keep pretending it didn't mean something. Please, Elena, just talk." She ended the call without a yes or no, the screen going dark in her palm, cold. The weight settled then, a quiet surrender in her chest, sinking. Resignation,